Hey everyone. Hi, I'm Ryan Clifford. I'm very glad to be here today to present at API Days London. I'm going to be talking about forming a strategy and how I've gone from API products to platform thinking. So I'm going to dive straight into it and first of all introduce who I am. So I'm Ryan Clifford, Group Product Manager for our platform here at Spendesk. I've worked previously at many financial institutions or fintechs working on developer platforms. So I've been at Barclays, Fiserv, and I'm now at Spendesk. I've kind of lived and breathed APIs and developer experiences for quite a while. So I'm very happy to be presenting here again on a different topic. So I'm going to dive into, first of all, what I would consider are the building blocks of a platform. And it starts really with your core capabilities or your core product as a business. And the way that I view it is you start building upon your core product and capabilities by exposing APIs. And I like the buzzword of APIs as products, and I'll dive into the reason why later on. But that may also extend into looking at exposing webhooks as well. But equally, I consider when I think of platforms looking at other means of exposing data. So it could be doing more file-based exports, or it could be looking at how do you connect your core product and your core capabilities to other tools via integrations, which is another topic that I'm going to be covering today. So the next layer, once you kind of expand your core product by looking at APIs, webhooks, exports, and integrations, is looking at the experience that goes with that for a developer. And that could mean things like your developer portal, having a sandbox experience to support that journey of someone testing out your API, having demos or developer tooling, and also support for all of these aspects. There's lots of different things that go into developer experience, and I'll talk about a few of them later on in today's session. And then I also like to look at other product enhancements, so ways that you can make interacting with your core product or your suite of APIs a bit easier. So it could be building upon it with SDKs, plugins, or what I would call a hosted solution. So quite a common term when it comes to the payments world is how can I have maybe a configurable payments checkout experience where I minimize how much I need to code and I have a UI to configure the experience instead. So as I mentioned, I'm going to dive into a few topics, and the first one I'm going to dive into is integrations. So when I look at the strategy for integrations, there's lots of things I consider, but a few of them that come to mind are how do you build out those integrations? And a few examples that I can pull on from my time at Spendesk and what we're doing here is you can look at doing direct integrations. So where you as the consumer can build a one-to-one integration with a provider. So if I think about Spendesk, we've built a one-to-one integration with NetSuite, and then we deliver that to our end users. But then there's also other ways of scaling and building integrations, instead of just doing one-to-one, but also looking at how do you leverage what we call unified integrators or partners. So the example here is how Spendesk can build with a partner who has a unified integrator who does one-to-many integrations. So in this example, there's a bunch of HR tools out there. We could go one-to-one and directly integrate with them all, but there are many HR tools if you start to look at multiple markets. So by partnering with a unified integrator, they can consolidate some of those integrations, and it means that you can scale and also have the best-in-class integrations without having to maintain many integrations. You can focus on that one-to-one with the partner. So with integrations, there's a few things that I think about when forming the strategy, and it starts with research. So understanding and mapping out your ecosystem. And what I mean by ecosystem is going, if you're a company that provides a certain service, what other tools does a consumer use? So when it comes to spend management, which is what Spendesk does, we look at, okay, we're providing spending capabilities, but there are other tools that someone would use when they're doing company spending. So it could be an accounting tool that they're looking to use as well. They have a HR system which populates their users. But then there's also other tools out there which they use for cash flow management. So really mapping out the ecosystem of, in my scenario, spend management, and then thinking about that end-to-end journey and how you can enhance your product by making your product seamlessly integrate into a user's experience. So I typically look at things like, how can I identify areas where we can automate some processes? So if there's any manual activities that people want to, say, take the users from a HR tool and manually get set up in your tool, how can you automate that journey? You can also look at increasing speed. So on the scenario around using a spend management platform and your accounting tool, there's a bit of processes there where you want to export data. How can you make exporting data to your accounting tool quicker? And then there's also little things out there which are maybe just delights to customers. So another area that we've looked at is, say, travel management. So when you're booking some travel, how can you automatically populate the receipt and invoice from that booking into your spend management system, just to make it a bit easier and take away some of the hassle? So starting with research is a key one for forming your strategy, because it really maps out the landscape and where you want to prioritize. But then looking at how do you build? How do you build strategically as well? So I mentioned before, there are many different ways of integrating. You can go the one-to-one direct approach, or you can maybe partner and use unified integrators. And there's more strategies out there as well. But what I would focus on is understanding what are your strategic tools that you want to prioritize having more control over. So having that one-to-one integration versus other tools where you maybe are happy to have kind of a third party involved. But that helps you to then think about where your strong partnership's going to be. So if you want a really, really strong partnership with a particular provider, you might opt for a one-to-one integration approach. And overall, that's how I would think about building. There are some examples, and I've spoken about strategies for integrations with other companies, and it is very dependent on your use case. I know others who have tried third-party tools, and the third party they've tried just didn't quite work because it didn't have the right stability that they needed. And I remember having a conversation where the third party that they chose was actually a tool which was doing some automation, and their main product was automation on their own UI, but they had added an extra product, which was a unified API. It wasn't the core product, it was the additional product. And the reason why it didn't really work well was because that wasn't the core product. It wasn't an API they were selling, it wasn't supported. They actually had a UI automation platform, and they thought they would enhance the platform by having an API. So when thinking about who your third-party provider is going to be, think about, do they actually have the right support mechanisms in place and reliability to use and leverage their API? And the third one is thinking about scaling and maintaining. Really think about how much can you maintain at a certain level of quality as well. So you may have lots and lots of different tools that you want to integrate with. You have to be strategic because it would take a lot to maintain integrations with them all, so you have to be selective. And this is where I start to also think about alternative routes to scaling, and that really brings me on to APIs as products. So the idea of building with APIs at scale is that you can build and maintain an API, and then you can get lots and lots of different partners to then build the integration to you. And what that means is you now just have to maintain an API, but you enable many, many integrations at scale. And those partners who are connecting to this API could be other technology companies, they could be your direct customers, it could be system integrators or developer agencies. There's lots of different personas who may use your API, and it's a good way of scaling. So when I think of platform, integrations and APIs together forms a holistic platform strategy. So I've got to jump into a few quick do's and don'ts in my experience of having worked now on 4 API platforms of what I've kind of learned along the way. So what I wouldn't do is just expose internal APIs. In particular, don't just expose your internal database structure. What you should be doing is trying to abstract some of that complexity and think about how will that developer use your API programmatically. So understand there may be some internal concepts that you have in your database, but a customer shouldn't necessarily have to know the inner workings. of your product and system. They should know the simplified version of how you're structured. Also think about how they might actually integrate and build with your API. I've seen some examples where you have fields which have in your database which are coded, but they are numbers that make no kind of real context without having a description with it. So think about whether you share a code or whether it's an enum, which is a bit more explicit. So there's different ways that you can think about sharing that data from your database, but really abstracting complexity. Second one is looking at, well, don't just build without having any customer validation. What I really recommend is designing an open API specification and sharing that with multiple customers or potential consumers to validate before you ever start building, because you can avoid a lot of mistakes by just sharing an open API spec, which you can really create quite quickly with today's kind of tool set out there. So it's something that's easy enough to do. So make sure you validate before you start to code. Third do's and don'ts is I wouldn't necessarily just follow standards and theoretical principles without thinking it through. Some things in theory work, but in practice they don't. So what I would say is don't be too rigid with principles. Look at how you can adapt those to really work for making a consumer's life easier when using those APIs. But also think about how do you maintain consistency across your APIs. So if you're going to have a set of design principles and if they do deviate from standards, you do recommend sticking to standards if you can, because it makes sense. But if you do deviate, make sure that you do it consistently across your APIs and also include some of that information in your documentation. And last do's and don'ts I want to share on APIs is don't just leave it to your engineers to design, build, and test. I'm a big fan of collaborating between product and engineering. And I also believe in API product managers. And the reason why I say that is because if you want to make sure you don't just expose your internal database and you abstract the complexity and you focus on user experience, you need to have a really good collaboration between a product manager and your engineering team to design something that's really good. So I'm going to move on now to developer experience, which I think underpins a lot of APIs and integrations and is key to a successful strategy. And the way I like to look at it is along this kind of lens of what does a developer experience journey look like. So if I start with discovery, there's a number of things you can do to increase awareness of your platform. So the kind of basics that you would have are things like your landing site, having an API catalog, but you might do things when it comes to thought leadership, articles, case studies. You might do events or hackathons, which are things that are really going to create some buzz around what you're doing. And then there's kind of what I would say basics around searchability. If someone searches for your API, do they find it? Do you have good rankings when it comes to SEO? Or are you listed on the right directories for APIs? Then moving from discovery, which is really, if someone comes to your site, can they understand in a couple minutes what your offering is? The next step is really onboarding. How can I start getting access, even if it's just a test? And typically it is, I've landed on your site, I understand what your offering is, but I now really want to test. So this is where you should have a simple enough registration process. I should be able to get an API key for a sandbox and then start to actually test out your API. And that's when it comes into building. And that's something where you definitely need the basics when it comes to your open API specification, but you might have more documentation to explain how to use your API, or you might have demos and tutorials, and you may have things like Postman collections, anything that makes it easier to really start building and testing with that API. Ideally, having this all as open as possible. And then you've got kind of the last stage, which is around production. So once you actually have a successful integration, how can you manage, how can you launch it? How can you manage the aftercare and iterate when there's new versions? So there's a bunch of things that I would class under this bucket of kind of production or aftercare when it comes to the developer experience, like monitoring, health status, change logs. And there's a few things which actually cut across many of these things. So you've got things like support. testing scenarios, and your developer community, which are things that can underpin your developer experience at all parts of this journey. But the biggest question I usually get is, where do we start? Because there's a lot of things there. And where I would start is pretty much on these ones that I've highlighted here. So having a landing site and having an API catalog are your basics to begin with. Having a registration flow and having API key generation and a sandbox are, I think, quite key. I've put an asterisk on API keys and sandbox because if you're really getting started at the beginning, there's a few things you can do where it's maybe not a perfect sandbox experience, but it's enough to get started, and then you can iterate and build on it. When it comes to building, I think your documentation, you need an open API specification. It's not hard to do a few pages of documentation to go along with that API spec. And then on production, I think having some form of monitoring, it could be just basic monitoring to begin with, but that's where I think there's some basics that you can get started with, along with having some avenue for support. It may not be completely automated support, but it can be some level of support to help kind of your early adopters through the process. So those highlighted boxes are where I would start when it comes to developer experience, and it's where I've started in my journey here at Spendesk around getting us to really get these points quite solid to begin with. Some quick do's and don'ts of dev experience from kind of the 4 platforms that I've learned from is, don't just think an open API specification is enough. You need to consider other documentation, whether it's a quick start guide, your sandbox, your try it out feature, or any demos. Don't be too high level from like a conceptual point of view, but also don't be too technical too quickly. I try and find a nice balance of, can someone, when they land on your website or your dev portal, understand, okay, what is that use case that your API supports? And then have the ability to dive deeper into going, okay, well, I am interested in that use case. How can I see an open API specification? How can I now try it out? Oh, okay, how can I now get a demo? How can I now dive into a very specific question in your kind of your FAQ? So think about gradually building up that technical knowledge to support different types of users. Then don't let your developer experience stagnate. It's not something that you just create and then leave. It's something that should be living and breathing. And what I would recommend is doing quality checks regularly to test out all your APIs, do some dog fooding, rotate who's actually doing that dog fooding so you get a different viewpoint on it, and see how easy is it to actually use your platform, your APIs, your products. And then don't wait for the perfect experience to be ready to launch. Try and do it small, fast, and iterative. Do regular user testing because you will find out a hell of a lot quite quickly if you do it regularly. And it's surprisingly easy, especially if you've got a developer who wants an API. If you just say, hey, I want to test out this dev experience on you, do you mind jumping on a call? They are usually willing to. So I want to kind of start wrapping up with a bit around adapting this to your organization, starting with a few case studies. So I've got 3 that I want to run through. Common one I get is, my organization doesn't understand the value of APIs. How would I tackle this? Well, I do it in 3 ways. So think about education. Start educating around the value of APIs and start talking through some success stories. And those success stories could be from other markets as well, and other industries, just to demonstrate the value of APIs. And then also start to contextualize it in terms of, what does it mean for your business? Where is the market moving? How do you become more kind of future forward looking? And that should hopefully educate your stakeholders to understand the value of APIs, but you then have to show value. So maybe look at, if you've got existing APIs, looking at how you can improve some of the current experiences is a good value add. So it could be that you have some APIs, but you have no developer experience and you get a lot of support questions. How can you start to show value by just having some documentation there to ease the number of support queries you get? Or maybe it's an internal API that's been exposed externally, and you might want to dive in and look at how can you improve that API experience. Also, if you're finding it hard to get people bought into kind of APIs and the value that they can have, start to look at how APIs can augment existing products that you have. So maybe that you have a product that you sell and you just want to expose an API so you can sell more of it, maybe via a partner who needs an API to access it. And the idea of this is it gets people used to what APIs are, and then eventually when it comes to scaling, you then might be able to diversify your APIs. So instead of just augmenting existing products, you can start to add new API products instead, which may be adding new capabilities, a new revenue stream. And generally, to scale, I would say you really need to adopt an API first mindset, and you need both your product teams and your engineering teams to adopt that mindset. Second case study, we've exposed inconsistent or internal APIs externally that are being used. How do we fix it? Sometimes it's a bit of the cat's out of the bag, we can't get it back in. How would I go about this? Again, some education. So first of all, understanding what is the value in externalizing an API, and actually what does it mean to have an external API? And this is where I'd start to talk about concepts around how do you abstract complexity, how do you not expose certain information. And a good way is kind of grounding it and what are the existing products and problems that you're experiencing because you've released inconsistent APIs, but give some guidance on a way forward. So say, here are the problems we're facing with these APIs, but here's a way we could go forward using these principles when it comes to API design, for example. Then, as I mentioned before, start showing value quickly. So fix some existing issues. Anything that you can link to customer demand is always a good thumbs up, and try and elevate that developer experience. And that should help to resolve and kind of bring your organization along the mindset of improving the platform thinking. And then if you really want to scale, think about consolidating your APIs, especially if you have a list of kind of internal APIs or inconsistent APIs that have been externalized. Look at how do you start to fix and remove and remediate. And the way that I would typically do it is, for your new APIs, which are your strategic APIs, make sure you have a really good developer experience and added features or capabilities that these APIs have, which your old inconsistent ones don't have. So the way that you can sell it to customers is, hey, we've got a new strategic API that's going to be supported far better than the current one that you're on. So let's help migrate you across to the new ones. And the last thing is a case study which I get quite a bit. How do I build APIs consistently across my organization? And I want to talk through this with a very quick Mona Lisa reference that I've got. So say you want your teams to design and build APIs, and you want them to paint the Mona Lisa. What I've found in experience is you get lots of different interpretations of API design when you just leave teams to design and build on their own, and it just looks messy. But a step forward could be looking at providing some standards for each team to follow. And what I've found is they tend to get a little bit better, but it's still got varying behaviors. APIs might act a little bit different when you go from one to another, but they might have some standards, but it's still not consistent across the piece. And that's because you can give some standards, but teams don't necessarily follow them or interpret them in the same way. So the next thing I've tried before is then having a central team to do API design. So all of your external APIs go through a central team. The trouble is it takes time. The quality is better, but it's slow and it's unscalable. So this kind of solution I've managed to get to at previous organizations that seems to have a nice balance is essentially having a central team that works on external APIs across the organization who provides governance and support. So the idea is, how do you provide standards and guidelines before, but also with the right support and help where API designers can jump in and help certain teams and kind of create this idea of, here's a paint by numbers, so that you make sure that you have consistency and control and some governance around what APIs go externally, but you have good quality, but can scale at the same time. So the idea here is you can do things like API design reviews so that other teams with guidance and demos and supports and frameworks can design an API, build an API, but that final staging is that they need to have it reviewed by the central team before it ever goes externally. So you have design reviews, you have build reviews, you have points along this journey to help increase the quality. So very lastly, I just want to wrap up with a quick story on the Spendesk Alpha API. So typically, from my experience of having worked now on 4 API platforms, it takes usually about 2 to 3 years to build a platform and start demonstrating some value from it. And I think 2-3 years is quite long. I was a bit ambitious when I joined Spendesk about 6 months ago. I told our executive team that I wanted to do what would typically take 2 to 3 years in 9 months. So the way that that looks like is essentially breaking it down into, first of all, making a commitment, setting a platform vision. So I did that in July, and I did a bold statement, as I said, with what our platform vision was going to be. And I'm very excited that today, at 3 months from announcing that, we're launching our Alpha API. And I love Game of Thrones references, so I really view this as, I've kind of said, we've got some dragon eggs. Alpha API, as in today, we have given birth to our API platform in Alpha, and the next steps are to then progress that into Beta. So our dragons have got to be born, and they've got to start to grow, start breathing some fire in January, and then we'll get to what we call general availability, and that's when the platform should be really, well, apparently burning places, but if you follow my Game of Thrones reference. So bold statement, again, it kind of lives some of those principles that I said around how do you show value iteratively, but validate step by step. So I'm very excited that I could announce today that developer.spendesk.com is live with our Alpha API. And I thank you for spending some time with me. A quick summary, just to leave you some takeaways, will be APIs and integrations. Think about how do you build that for scale and maintenance, and how do you balance building integrations directly yourself versus opening up an API. And if you do open up an API, treat APIs as products. When it comes to developer experience, think holistically around that experience and try and optimize so you can self-serve a lot of that journey. And also balance, are you talking to a business persona? Are you talking to a technical persona? Are you talking to a hybrid persona who's a bit of both? And try and balance that so you don't just cater for one audience only. And the last thing is adapting. Show value as soon as possible. That's an example that I had before around launching an Alpha API very quickly in a couple months. It's so that we can start celebrating some of those marginal gains that we're going to get, while also trying to build out what is our target operating model for when we get to general availability at the end of my 9 months. Do we have the right organization to support an API platform? So thank you very much. I'd love to take any questions. Feel free to connect with me, and thank you for your time.